Okay. So I would like to welcome everybody to this webinar. I think it's more of an interview with Robyn Walser. Welcome, Robyn. I wrote something down. I wanted to just say some words on your behalf. So my next guest is probably one of the most lovable people you will ever meet in your life. And because everybody likes her, I was kind of hesitant in the beginning. I told you this story that I was like, okay, everybody loves Weber Walser. So my mind was going, okay, so everybody loves her. So there's got to be something wrong with her. So, and then I think we really hit it off at Steve's party where he had his final talk for the university, and we had such a great time. And I remember sitting in the car with Spencer Smith, driving back, and I was just silent and said, "Fuck, she's cool." And that was my first encounter, real encounter with you, I think. And yeah. Um, Robyn, not only are you one of the greatest pioneers in ACT, you then also became one of my favorite persons. So, my distinguished guests with the absence of sound, please raise your hands for the superwoman of ACT, for the tormentor of trauma, for the wonderful and the beautiful Robyn Walser, everybody.
Oh,
Welcome, Robyn.
thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and that's a lovely, lovely introduction. And if you get to know me a little more, you will start to find the things that, the glitches. You do see them.
They are there, but they're small and they have to be alcohol induced. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I talked to you that I said I have a surprise question for you. So
Yes.
here it goes. Are you ready? Okay. So the surprise question is it's a two-parter because we're both obsessed with dogs. So sorry about this, but we just have to do this little part before we start with the content. What dog would you want to be? That's the first one. And the second part is what dog, if you're really honest, are you actually?
Oh, um, I think I'd like to be a Malinois. Is that how you say it?
A what?
A Malinois. It's kind of like a German Shepherd,
Right.
right? Very,
Oh yeah. 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 I think in Dutch it's a Mechelse herder. It's
yes,
yeah.
but I'm actually more like a pug. More like a pug than I am a
Cool.
Malinois.
Cool. I just really wanted to know that about you. So I think I want to be a golden retriever, and I actually am a German Shepherd, I think. Because I want to be that gullible, like I want to be that, but I'm not. And my wife said, "Yeah, you're not. You're just a German Shepherd. Just doesn't like everybody, but if you do get into the family, he will protect you with his life."
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So, maybe the first real question is, how did you get into contact with ACT? What is your personal journey? Because we all have that, and I'm just really interested, and I think we all are. How did you came to ACT yourself?
Yeah. I started actually knowing absolutely nothing about who Steve Hayes was, what he was about. I was interested in working on trauma,
Hmm.
and so I
Oh, that
applied
was from the get-go.
from the get-go. So trauma
Yeah.
was my initial orientation. And I had planned to go to University of Nevada, Reno, or I applied there because there was somebody there who was working in the field of trauma, and I wanted to continue that work. So when I went to my first interview with Steve Hayes, I don't know if he would remember this. I didn't know who he was, and I'm glad because I wasn't anxious because I didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
When I came in to do the interview, he kind of sat back and he put his arms up behind his head and he crossed his feet and he said, "All right, here's my first question. What is a thought?" Which is a very young person. I was like, oh, how do I even answer this question? But because I didn't know him, I sat back too, and I kind of put my hand behind my head and I crossed my feet. And I just gave him an answer that had to do with like monism and dualism and
Yeah.
how thoughts develop, and it worked out okay. Then I got into Reno, and Steve held, this was in 1991. In the first month, he held an ACT workshop, and it changed everything. So I I ended up going to his lab. I ended up straddling labs because I'd come to work with this other person. I straddled that lab for 3 years. But that first workshop changed my whole trajectory. And I had an experience in that workshop where I really connected with self as context, and it
Right.
was incredibly freeing. And it's just, I've never looked back, and moved into his lab and have been working there since 1991, or was working there. I'm not working there now. I'm clean.
Not anymore.
I'm
Yeah.
not a,
You're not a lab rat anymore, no.
I kind of combined trauma and act work and have been sort of cruising in that direction ever since.
And do you can you tell us a bit more about that spark? Because now I'm really interested. The change of perspective to seeing the self. Could you elaborate a little more about what was that?
So he did the child exercise, which many of you are familiar with, and I had
Mhm.
never encountered any kind of exercise like that. And given that I do come out of a trauma history
Right.
myself,
Hmm.
was able to kind of look upon that little girl and
Mm. Oh wow.
see her innocence and her sorrow and her joy. And there was just something about it that just felt incredibly freeing, and um, that I can hold her in ways that other people can't. And that was sort of the key moment, was seeing that little girl and recognizing that I could have a different relationship with myself.
Oh wow. So that's like a connection with your true pure self, something like that.
Yeah, I think that sort of innocence of language space, right? Like
Yeah.
younger versions of us that don't criticize and aren't all caught up in the world of language. And I've always, to be sure though, I've never liked the approach to human suffering of, you're a dysfunctional thinker,
Yeah.
you're an illogical thinker, you're
You're
an erratic.
broken.
That broken, I never liked that. So I sort of
Yeah.
came in with a prep, I guess I would say, for
Yeah.
new message that wasn't about you having broken thinking. And so I think I was probably open to this idea of finding a way to look at ourselves that wasn't about, the badness within or something like that.
Now that I think about it, because of course I followed your work and I read everything you wrote, and it seems like this is the essence of your work now as well, like finding that pure sense of self, like that innocent, compassionate, like unbroken part that's there for everybody.
I
Wow.
think the way to describe it is that I work with clients that way, and I'm hopefully doing trainings that way. And I just see that self as context and perspective taking is just fundamental. And what a beautiful place if you can help people get to that space and really see themselves as experiencing beings rather than stories that they have.
Yeah. So I had a question about what is your favorite exercise, but all of those exercises kind of go around there, right?
Yeah. Yeah, almost anything self as context, but I really do like the perspective on yourself as a child, and how would you meet yourself. That feels
Yeah.
really important to me, and because we stand against ourselves so much of the time, right? Like
Yeah.
literally inside of a battle with our own sense of who we are and our learned thoughts. We don't stay in contact with the fact that these thoughts are learned. We think that they're ours. We don't recognize that they came from outside in.
Yeah.
Ik weet dus waar ik wil
And
luisteren.
that sort of sense of being able to see yourself beyond language is, I think, just incredible, and really incredible for trauma survivors, because they're so caught up in the story of damaged, broken,
Yeah.
not okay, you know, something's wrong with me, and why did this happen to me? So it just can have a real freeing quality there.
So do you think this is true for all the people and all the problems, or is it just specifically for trauma that you kind of hover around the self? Because I sometimes say maybe the self should be central in the act, because the relationship with yourself is so important for all of those things.
Yeah.
What's your
I,
vision on that?
so is the question, do I think self as context is central?
Yeah, in other problems as well. I can totally imagine it's for trauma, it's really relevant, but do you see that in anxiety problems or depression everywhere?
Across the board.
Wow.
Across, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you think about, like, if you look at something like depression, and think about the way when people really get stuck in depression and they're sort of collapsed inside of it, it's almost like a relationship with self that is really caged and captured,
Mhm.
right? It's almost like the inner world and the story of my pain has taken over.
Yeah.
And they're standing against yourself as like, my pain should not be my pain. And they forget to look out into the world and see that there's a me and my pain and other experiences, and there's a world out here. And so that self as context position allows those different perspectives. And instead of collapsing into the self, you can be curious and open and discovering what's in here, but also what's out here in the world as well.
And seeing the difference between the two of those, right? Seeing the difference between what is you and what is contextually you. Could you, for the people who don't really get that quite yet, could you explain that?
Like this self as context, like the
Yeah,
holder.
yeah, yeah.
So um, the way I like to think about this is that, you know, we were all once babies, and you may not remember that, but you were once like this big, and you were innocent, you were free from all of the verbal stuff that's going on. Of
Mhm.
course, you were still an experiencing being, right? You were encountering the world and the environment, and you were emoting and reacting and learning, but you were probably the freest you'll ever be is when you're in terms of languaging and how languaging impacts us. And that sense of you, that experiential sense of you that was encountering the world as an experiencing being as a baby never goes away. It's always there. It's just that language gets added in. And so this distinction between self as verbal and self as experiencer is really important, because once we get that verbal thing on board, we move away from the innocence of language and the experiencing self that's more raw and is in motion. Like, there's a being here that's not static, it's a very dynamic being. And what that means is whatever you're experiencing is flowing, it's moving, it's rising, it's falling. And mind doesn't like it doesn't like the chaos of that, right? Like it likes clear and orderly and problem solving and descriptions and evaluations. And you know, what's going on inside of us isn't always orderly. It's responsive to the stimulus in the environment and isn't always under our control. But if we can be present to and aware of that, consciously aware of that experiencing self, then we don't have to live inside of rigid or captivating stories that limit limit the meaning that we can create in our lives.
Mhm.
So that beingness that's beyond words is the selfish context that I'm referring to, if that helps describe. If
Yeah.
that is, yeah.
What would your definition be of that part of the self? Because it's a constant, right? It's
It's a
a
concept.
uh, pure form of
Yes, it's real. It's hard to describe
yeah,
because words are not it,
yeah,
right? It's
yeah.
start describing it. That's not it anymore. It's a felt sense. Consciousness is a felt experience. And it's not like you were born when you got language, you were born when
Mm,
you were, and so the felt sense of being. And even if you think about something like a baby connecting with its um, mother or father in this kind of, just eyes are being felt or held or whatever the case might be, there's things happening there. There's a being that's alive and connected there and experiencing the world from not an IU space yet because those things haven't been defined, but it's not absent because you don't have IU.
mm,
And so, I mean, consciousness itself has long been philosophized about, and people try to understand it and what is it, and it's been argued about, and still people don't have a full sense of it, I don't think, because
yeah.
you can look at RFT and languaging and the IU here now kinds of relationships that develop. Um, but there's still a transcendent sense that maybe is outside of the IU here now space. I don't know that everybody in the community would agree with me on that, but that's how I view it, is that there's a larger experiencing being there. And um, we're now wondering, like we've asked questions like, are animals conscious? Do they have a conscious
Yeah.
awareness? And, the answer used to be pretty definitively no. But as we begin to understand animals more, we may not have that actually correct. There
Yeah.
may be levels of consciousness in animals that we're discovering as we think about how much we're aware of our own experience. And
And
um,
the idea, of course, is the more you get in contact with that constant thing, the less the trauma and the difficult things are going to affect you, right?
correct.
Right. Because I always say that trauma is like sticky memories,
Yeah.
like they stick to your skin and yeah. So that's the aim here, right? To make that content, the contact, and then practice it more and more. And now that you're saying this, I'm like, Jesus, I think she's really practicing this herself, right? Are you still, because I think it's weird to say because I'm just thinking it like, why does everybody like Robyn Walser? I think maybe that's why, because you're so pure and so stable in contact with everybody. I haven't seen you change a little bit when we drink alcohol or do some weird stuff in Argentina, but that were extreme circumstances. But I'm like this, I can be angry, I can be sad, I can be stuck in my descriptive self, I think, and I see that constant with you, like more with more stability. Is that true? Are you really practice what you preach, kind of?
Well, so I practice is the best word to put in here. It's like I really try to practice this space, but I surely get caught in content and stories and have my own struggles and sufferings. I mean, that's clearly part of what
Yeah.
happens. You know, I
I'm
just
not
I want
saying you're Buddha, but I'm just saying that I think you give people a really secure feeling when they talk to you. And that for me, that gives me the idea that you have that feeling for yourself as well,
I
like a
do
secure place where you can
like
go.
a secure place, and that self as context
Yeah.
space. But I can fall out of it for sure and get entangled. I mean, we don't have to go into this territory at all, but as you all know, we just had an election And I'm really caught up in the stories about the whole
Sorry
thing.
for your loss.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just an example, right? I've been waking up at night and struggling and fearing. And so that's just an example of places I have to keep practicing, and I'm really practicing right now. And so I absolutely think practice is the right word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And connecting with that pure sense of self, like you're not broken, you're not the content that the environment gave you. You're just a stable human being. You just have the illusion that you're not, right?
Yeah.
So there's almost a connection with a form of enlightenment here, right?
I do think it can operate that way, but one of my favorite book titles is first the Enlightenment and then the Laundry.
Yeah, yeah, I read that book actually. Yeah,
It's a very good reminder of how this works and why it's a practice, right? Is that yes, and there's life is still unfolding, and you still have to, feed the dog and take the trash out, and you know, interact with family members and all those things that are about being alive in the world. And so um, I appreciate the practice and the recognition that we're falling out of it almost continuously.
yeah. So moving on to a kind of a different topic here because I noticed especially in Argentina at the Congress that you really have a sort of a scientist practitioner kind of attitude towards your work. And I love that because I think most people don't do the effort to do that or have just don't have any time to do it. Why is that important for you? And how do you do it?
Well, in some senses, it's been circumstance. I mean, when I came out of graduate school, after a few stumbles, I landed in a job at the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, where we were doing both clinical work and research, which I love that I like both of them. And so from very early on in my career in Steve's lab, like they were always combined. And I think that I want to digest data critically, and
Mhm.
I want to look at, you know, biases and heuristics and all those kinds of things. And I want to be thoughtful about how we're approaching human behavior. So it is about science, absolutely, but it's also about human beings.
Yeah.
And so I never want to turn to science at the sacrifice of the human being.
Because you
And
want to be diligent about the human suffering and because it's humans involved, right?
yes,
So it's an ethical issue as well
yeah,
to
agreed.
do that.
Yeah. And, we have a long way to go with science, I think, especially around human behavior. And, I, thinking about self-report measures, for instance, we know the flaws in self-report.
Yeah.
And, how do you get glimpses into this? And in the National Center, for instance, we have um, clients who are invested in making sure their self-reports are not accurate, because it means loss of money and loss of special status and things like that. So,
Mm.
there's the contextual variables around this play such an important role. And, um, in the clinic that I work in, the trauma clinic now, uh, you can have a client sitting in front of you saying things are so much better, and then you give them a PCL, a post-traumatic checklist, and they report fours and fives, which are as high as you can go. And you're like, I don't understand. With here you're saying this, and here you're saying this, and
Yeah.
so I'm aware that we need to keep pursuing science, but that we also need to be like we haven't quite worked it all out yet in terms of
Yeah.
what this looks like, and how to measure some of these unusual things. And you know, in a clinical frame, I don't maybe I'd be curious how many people on the call are aware of this. But there's research done that looks at client report in therapy session, like post post-treatment, if you ask clients, did you say the things you needed to say? 50% of clients in a number of studies, about 50% on average, say I didn't tell my therapist things I needed to tell them that
Wow.
were in my treatment.
Yeah.
Like I withheld information.
Yeah.
And so it makes me think, like, when you think about AI, for instance,
Yeah.
the only thing AI can learn from is the data that you give it.
Yeah. True.
Same with us. Like, we've got the data of the person in the room, if you want to call it data, like who is this human being in front of me, and what they're telling us, what they give us access to.
Yeah.
So there's a real dilemma if they're only giving, if 50% of clients are not giving you access to things that are important and relevant.
We need to solve this, Robyn. How are we going to do
That's a really good question.
that?
One thing that I do recommend for clinicians is to ask it at some kind of regular interval in some way and use your good judgment. Is there something you're not telling me?
Right. Yeah.
Which we don't typically think to
Yeah.
ask, right? It's not like built in, but is there something that you're afraid to share?
Yeah.
Is, is there something here that I need to know that's not in the
Yeah.
room? Like different ways
Do
you
I
can.
have everything? Yeah.
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 And even then, I mean, the narrative people have is subjective as well, right? I mean, people don't even know that they know that they know that we know that they know that, right?
Well, and
Because,
sometimes there was a study done, and I don't remember who did it, where people don't know that they don't know.
yeah,
Like, like that's kind of interesting, right? Is that
right?
they don't know that they don't. The skill to know that you're not doing well in an area is also the skill that would help you do well in an area. So
Yeah,
there's some kind of
right.
twisting things about how humans operate with their knowledge.
And I mean, even the amount of variables. I mean, I talked in Argentina about my story about that I had these severe depression thoughts, and it turned out to be a bacteria.
Yeah.
So that was fucked up, but I didn't know that. And that was just by accident. And I've talked to five, six people from Argentina who got themselves tested, had the bacteria as well, by the way. So
Oh,
it really helped a lot of people out.
yeah.
But if they hadn't met me and if I hadn't met like this, so there's so many, I think, how do you think about that? Like the interaction between still the coping issues we have with ACT, of course, and the more PBT-ish kind of functional analysis, contextual things like the social cultural parts and the biophysiological parts. What's your vision on that?
Well, I am really appreciating the um, what do I want to call it? The call to remember that we're working with a whole organism,
Right.
like whole organism in context.
Mm.
And I think, as I've seen across time, that some people on this call have heard me talk about this, is that there's always a drift from the original meaning, content, experience of what um, you're trying to convey. And so if you think about ACT as a product for clinicians to learn and engage, that as it gets disseminated, it gets diluted. And the place that it moves to is typically technique. And
Yeah.
the people doing just tech, like they'll be doing technique after technique and call it ACT and lose the processes and
Yeah,
levels of,
actual process. Yeah.
and in the part of the issue with that is that then you also forget to ask questions, if you're just looking at technique, about body and environment and sociocultural factors like marginalization or racism or other kinds of things that might be influencing behavior.
Right.
But where ACT started, it like if you I like to use the analogy of a food color in water. If let's say you have blue food coloring and you put a drop of it in the water, when it first lands in the water, it's like a really intense blue.
Hmm.
And of course, as it disperses out, it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And
Right.
that's what happens to therapy interventions as they get disseminated.
Mm.
How do you come back to blue? How do you come back to that original drop,
Yeah.
which from the beginning, ACT has been whole organisms in an environment with their learning history.
Yeah.
And so to ignore the body and to ignore the environment was never intended in the ACT perspective.
Yeah.
You just have to look at the definition of functional contextualism and you've got the whole organism. And so for instance, the E model, the extended
Mm.
evolutionary method, is a very good reminder to come back to the blue.
Yeah.
And and for some people it'll be completely new because they've touched ACT when it was for their first time, when it was already in a light blue color.
Yeah.
And so they might not have known, they may not be paying attention to whole organism in context with a
Yeah.
learning history. They're in the technique space. And so the E model, in addition to talking about variation, retention, and selection, sort of pulls people back over to the blue, in my opinion, anyway,
Yeah.
the way I think about it.
It's more like, okay, what is this in the context of this and this instead of, okay, this is it. Right.
Yes,
And
not just like the whole organism and how do we help the whole
yeah.
organism function in their environment, looking at the whole organism, right? Like
Yeah.
the
I just wrote something down to really comprehend it. This and so what you're basically saying is that therapeutic interventions should spread out to the context of the client more.
yeah,
Right.
and that's been true for ACT from the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So instead of just doing flat exercises, like we're going to do a mindfulness exercise, we're going to do this one, this one, this one. It's like, okay, how does this exercise reflect in your context, in your daily life, and can you connect with different kinds of processes as well to make it to
And
give it hooks? Is it like that?
the way I think about it, if I'm understanding what you're suggesting, is that um, if you're doing a good functional analysis, that's going to inform what your process you're
Yeah,
doing.
yeah,
That it's not okay. I know this technique and I know this technique, and
yeah,
I'm going to do this one, then I'm going to do this one. It's instead it's how does this behavior function for this person? What's the contingencies? What's happening here? Has it got multiple functions? Does it have one
yeah,
function? Does it function differently in different contexts? And then what process am I going to use to change the function so that it's healthier? And but I also have to do this.
yeah,
I also recognize the function of my behavior in the therapy room. So I can't just track the function of their behavior. I need to track the function of my behavior as well.
yeah,
Why am I doing what I'm doing? What is it in the service of? Where are we headed with this work? And so um, when people are saying, how do I know what to do? I say, what's your functional analysis and what's your
right.
intent given that functional analysis?
Yeah. And then we're back to the scientist practitioner stuff as well, because a lot of people don't want to make functional analysis, but I think it's the only way to really understand what's going on with this particular client in this particular context, right?
Yes, exactly. And
So I wrote down what is the process that is central in that specific context for that specific client.
yes,
Is that it?
yes,
Did we get it?
yes.
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 I know you're critical about artificial intelligence, and so am I. I think it's going to be a train wreck. But before that, hey, we're gonna enjoy it a little more, I think. Could it have a role in all of those different variables? Because we know it's so difficult as a therapist to actually know what is important and what's not. Do you see opportunities there, or are you just
I mean, as clinicians, we're testing hypotheses, right? We're
yeah,
looking to behavior changes, and if it doesn't, we need to test another hypothesis. And
Yeah,
so, I mean, that's part of the scientist practitioner way of approaching it as well.
sure. Yeah,
So AI is fascinating, and I think it has the capacity to do some really good things, and if not well attended to, has the capacity to do some pretty harmful things.
yeah,
And so I'm I'm sort of sitting on the in a place of let's wait and see. But here's the thing that I am sure about is that it's going to move forward in terms of how it's going to be used in therapy, whether we like it or not. And so we might as well have a seat at the table and have some influence in terms of what's going to happen.
yeah,
Because you get big tech companies making some decisions about this, and they're going to be just dumping books in and having AI learn through books. But I am skeptical for a number of reasons, at least now. And one of the reasons I'm skeptical, and just doing the little bit of research that and understanding as far as I understand it, because I like Chat GPT. It's kind of fun, and you know you can ask some interesting questions, and so I like the fact that it can generate questions for CEU, so I don't
yeah,
have to do like those are
yeah.
really
They're ridiculously good, by the way. I sometimes get answers is like, holy shit, yeah, that's better than I thought of. Yeah, and I'm doing this for, yeah, okay,
but maybe the thing that the like I said earlier, AI can only learn given the data that you give it to learn on. So it whatever you feed in is how it's going to learn. And so what that means is who are you and what are you feeding in? What data are you giving AI to learn this?
hmm,
And is that biased?
right,
It probably is biased in some way. And is it, what are, and part of what's interesting about AI is that people don't like, even some experts not even sure how it's learning sometimes. Like
yeah, no
they're not,
idea,
yeah.
yeah.
Maybe you heard about the wolf and the dog thing. Did you hear about that? Do you know this
No?
thing? So they were trying to teach AI how to distinguish between a wolf and a dog. And so, just give it the data, lots of examples of both, and teach it how to, this one's a dog, this one's a wolf, this one's a dog, this
Yeah,
one's a wolf.
you have me a dog.
Yes. And they were trying to figure out how it was learning to do it because it was identifying them correctly after a period of time, after a period of time. And what they discovered, and I don't know how they discovered this, is that it was making the distinction based on snow. So what does snow have to do with that? Snow, like snow
What the,
falling
yeah,
on,
yeah, what the hell?
yeah. And so essentially, you see wolves more in snow. And
Right.
so this doing was a kind of correlation.
Oh,
And so it was picking the wolves based on how often it was seeing them in the snow. And here's the problem with that. It's correlation. It's not causation. What we know about correlation is that you can be way off when you're
yeah.
correlating.
It snowed here today. People are going to shoot my dog.
Right. So if you start thinking about what it is that you're putting
Yeah,
into AI to help it learn,
sure. Yeah,
when you don't know how it's learning it, like you
yeah,
could be getting pieces of information, they're not really useful to what it is that you're trying to do. I'm
yeah,
trying to understand wolves from dogs. What does that have to do with snow?
yeah.
It's
So you're
correlated.
saying there could be a extremely subjective kind of thing going on there, and we should be alert for that as therapists as well, because yeah,
Because
we're
AI could pump something out to you
yeah,
saying do this, but how did it get there?
yeah,
And is it just a little thing that you would have never thought
yeah,
like is not relevant to what you need to do if you're
sure.
identify dogs or dogs or snow. I
But
mean,
it could, yeah, and it could be the other way around too, because I talked to Steve about this, and he said, well, with Minecraft, I put my data in there. and then we'll have the data for everybody in the world who has the same pattern, and maybe get the suggestion like maybe you should get your blood tested, and we could solve a lot of problems there. So, oh, it's such a I'm having such a love-hate relationship with it because I think it could be so awesome and it can be so devastating as well.
Well, and I do think that, I mean, just on a personal level, given my sort of desire for human beings to
Right.
connect,
Yeah.
that we're already in a place where people's faces are buried in phones, and go into any restaurant and you can look around and partners and lovers and families are like,
Yeah.
"Meh," you know, and I see some utility because we don't have the reach that we need for all
Sure.
the people suffering. And I've seen people benefit from interacting
Yeah.
with a, an avatar. Um, but at what cost
Yeah.
is worry is like, I like the flesh and bone.
Yeah.
And, what does it mean flesh and bone disappears? And I know people argue against that, but if you look, that's not what's happening. People are getting more and more buried in their phones,
Yeah.
losing the human connection. I can't tell you the number of parents and people that I supervise where the parents are struggling because their kids are inside their phones constantly.
Sure. Yeah.
So even though you say, no, that won't go away, well, that's not what I'm seeing. That's not what my eyes are telling me. And so this part I'm really concerned about.
Yeah, and even talking through Zoom because I mean I love that you're here and I love to connect with you. But I mean the fun we had in Argentina and when I met Steve for the first time in 5 years, the first thing he saw me and he said, "Fuck, you're big." And I talked to him for like 5 years almost every day, and
Yeah.
I was like, "Fuck, those ears are big."
Oh.
So that was my first reaction. It's so different. It's so different when you can actually see something someone in 3D. But that's the emotional part. Scientifically, why is it important, you think, as a therapist, that we keep on seeing real clients?
Well, when I think about things like attachment theory and how we come to cohere and collaborate, and why you are important to me
Yeah,
is because I know you're an emotional being, and I know that you have pain, and I know that because I have it too, and I can sense it when I'm in the room, and I can feel it and see it and touch it and taste it, if that
yeah,
makes sense. And what this medium does is it separates you from that. It's like, many of you are aware of the monkey studies where they put a baby in a baby monkey. I mean, these are unfortunate. I don't condone these things, but they
sure,
put
yeah,
a in a cage and they give it a wire mother, or they give it a wire mother with a blanket over the top.
right, yeah,
And the monkeys that are raised with the blanketed mother do way better than the monkeys that are raised with the wire. We need to pay attention to that. Like, there's something about the attachment and the connection, the human connection, and in almost every species that
and coming back now, the sense of self, right? Sense of feeling secure, sense of feeling connected, sense
yes.
of feeling unbroken, like there's a part of me that can connect with you. So maybe becoming aware of somebody else who becomes aware of you, then you become aware of yourself. Is that weird to say?
Well, I understand what you're saying, but I think AI can develop enough that you probably wouldn't need a human being to
Yeah.
become aware. Like
Did
it
you see
could.
that film, Her?
I didn't see it. I didn't see it.
Yeah, that's just a great movie to see for everybody. It's about it's from 10 years ago, I think, but it's really about this like people having a really personal connection with yeah, with an AI computer, and yeah, it's probably doable to it's probably going to be there, but yeah, we'll see. I don't know if it's going to be. I don't know. It's so double because I think there's so many people who are lonely and probably can get help and connection, and even if it's not true, if it helps them. And then I think we all want to have everybody to have a real connection. Yeah,
It's a complicated issue because of this, right? Like
yeah,
reach is amazing and I do think there are places where it can be really helpful. And I've watched a virtual reality therapy session.
yeah,
It's been a while since I've seen it. It was horrible in my opinion.
yeah,
But that was my opinion. The guy who I was watching, so the virtual, you saw this little demonstration
yeah,
where I came up and was talking to the head, this woman's head. There was a cartoonish character, right? An
yeah,
avatar. And she was doing things that you might think a therapist would do is a little bit corny, like a
yeah.
exaggeration of a therapist, but it was tilting its head and it was saying, oh, that must be hard. You know,
I can see you look at her like, oh, fuck you.
just, I went into panic mode. And but the guy who was doing it said
Yeah,
he felt like a little bit better after talking to her.
client's always right.
What do you mean? You felt better?
She shit.
Did you
Go
see
to me.
that? That's the dilemma is that I think some people can benefit. And I even have a friend who it has like a kind of girlfriend that's I don't know, it's a electronic girlfriend. And I feel sad about it, but he
Yeah,
says it's helpful.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a very, very strange process that we find ourselves going through.
It's a weird time to be in. Yeah. So how do you see the future of ACT? And I mean, we talked about AI now, but I mean, the general future, how do you see us moving forward as a field?
Well, so I like the return to blue in the, EAM
Yeah,
approach and thinking about whole organisms. I do think that in some fashion we're probably going to have to fight for the human connection part of it. Um, and kind of like, fighting for the collaboration of humankind and connection.
yeah.
Because I think connection is part of what's led us to why we are in this terrible place in the world that we are now. We otherize, we don't know people, we assume these things, and we've got very divided spaces, and it's
That's a difficult part to sell, right? Sorry for interrupting, but it's because it's such a general, I mean, I feel you, but it's how do we get people to really understand the importance of that?
well, unfortunately, in some ways, I think we got to be in the room, and you said it
Yeah,
yourself. Like when we went to Steve's gathering, like being next to you in the room and meeting you and laughing together, like
that's where the
just
magic happened.
that was where the magic was. Like
Yeah,
that laughter and that presence and
yeah,
that, like, there's something inside of that we shouldn't walk away from.
yeah.
And so I guess we're going to have to find a way to, there's another blue drop that we got to hold on to and not let it diffuse. And I think it maybe is just personal commitment. Like, I'm not going to let that happen, at least as long as I'm alive. And so I will say, I think there's lots of good things that can be
Yeah.
developed. But we got to get to the table and say, here's our concerns, and here's where we don't want to go south on these things. Here's why I think this is important. We're already disconnected as a species, and that disconnection causes problems and otherizing and hatred and evaluation and et cetera, et cetera. And so how do we maintain that? And I think it's through touch and
Right.
warmth, warmth and, you know, seeing each other in eyes in real time. And so I don't know, maybe I'm a romantic, but I kind of hope that we will not go so far down the track that, we lose that part of ourselves.
Yeah, so you're probably already answered my following question because I have this question like, what would you say to young professionals in this context who are just starting with that? Because I was raised up without internet, which I think was awesome. Because what if we had internet, Robin? We would probably not. I would probably go insane when I would have had internet when I was young, and you with your past and your difficulties. I
Yeah,
mean,
I did. Yeah, I actually, my mom made us go play outside. Like we had to go play in the world when I was young,
yeah,
and I'm really appreciative of that.
yeah.
Um,
So your advice would probably be like, okay, just don't forget that the basic human connection you have with your client. Is that true?
yes. And so two things. Don't stop learning the processes. Like I've been doing
Right.
this for a long time and I'm still in it and looking and reading and trying to understand and practicing. So wherever you start, don't stop.
Yeah.
And
And
don't
what
lose the
I'm sorry, but what within that is your biggest advice? Because people often tell me like ask me like what how do I know for what client to do what thing? Because I read the books, but then it's like I have an interview, like you prepare and then something else happens. And then you're like, oh shit, I prepared an answer and now something else happens. Maybe that's a very difficult question, but do you have any advice on that?
Well, so I would raise this above sticking with it, and that's that, when I say heart in some ways, keep your heart in it. It is about being present to and aware of the person sitting across
Right.
from you. And so like that is a practice as well. And that if you're in the room and reading what's happening, you can be more responsive to the client
Mm,
rather than listening to your head say, do this exercise.
right.
Like you can see if somebody's, you know, smiling while they're talking about something really painful and address that rather than whatever it is they're talking about. Or you can see that they, you know, looked down for a moment when you introduced a topic and
Yeah.
you can be into that. What happened there? What was, like there's body language and felt senses of things that you can gain by being in the room with somebody. So don't lose the heart of this, and that's the human connection of it.
And that's kind of an act thing as well, like the willingness to start without knowing anything, right? Because then your head is going like, okay, I'm gonna have to do a mindfulness exercise today. So to like to really observe your mind doing that and then kind of dare to react intuitively. Is that it?
I think
To
that that's for sure. I mean, we need the head part.
yeah.
Like the learning is good, and absolutely we should be learning and reading, and all that is good, but it's just simply not enough. And get supervision, take risks, um,
Important. Yeah.
yep, notice your own avoidance and how might that be playing out in the room. And it's like a lifelong awareness process in some ways,
Yeah.
to and others, to myself and others.
Okay. Something we can do questions from the audience as well. So people, if you have questions, please put them on the chat, and then Barry will ask them. But first, is there something you still want to talk about? A thing you wanted to mention, or a book you wanna? Do you have a new book coming? Yeah, you have several new books coming, I know.
I do have a couple new books. I'm really excited about both of them. One is a self-help book for trauma.
Right. Oh, that's coming, right?
It's going to be released like in a couple of months.
Oh, cool.
And then another, a self-help act in trauma. And then Manuela O'Connell and I have just been wrapping up a deliberate practice for acceptance and commitment therapy. And we start with functional contextualism and go all the way through to the therapeutic relationship. And there's exercises in every chapter, including functional contextualism and RFT and behavior analysis. And so there's practice all throughout, and both beginners and intermediate and advanced work. And so we're pretty excited about that book as well. And that will be out sometime mid-year next year.
Oh, awesome. I'm just so much looking forward to both of those. And we have content on the app as well. We're working, you're working on it. I'm just putting it on there. So there's more to come probably in the future with the trauma-related things we have there. So there are already wonderful exercises, meditations on there, uh, who I did together with you because I was just recording, but I was doing them. And I've got a pretty dark past myself, and only just doing that with half that really helped me out. So yeah, it's really powerful stuff. Um, so thank you so much so far. Barry, Barry,
Yes,
do you have any questions from the audience?
there are some questions. Thank you, Robin, and guys, so far. I have several questions. I will start with the first one. Robin, is it that people who are in their phone are somewhat in a kind of subconscious level next to the normal level? So, yeah, that's the question.
Can you repeat the
Yeah,
question?
Kind of like how do you see people on their phone in the sense of self, like are they present? Are they in contact with, or are they losing themselves? What how do you see that?
I think it's an interesting question. And I think probably I can only speak about it anecdotally and my own
Hmm.
sense of being on the phone. There are ways in which people get really lost. And let's say I'm on Instagram or something like that, and I'm sort of scrolling through, I can really get captured by it. And what happens is I'll look at the time and I'll be like, holy mackerel. Oh, I just spent a whole hour.
Yeah.
It's gone like that. So it's almost like you're lost to the experience. Now, that in and of itself is not problematic per se, but is it values based? And it are there costs to it? And if I've seen this with my
That's so
niece.
important, I think. This is such an important point because I can watch dog videos all day and I won't regret it because it's giving me like dopamine and it's giving me like a joyful day. But then it's connected to my values, right? So yeah.
Yeah, and just this morning I was supervising somebody who has a client who watches porn constantly, and it's very pleasurable, but it's costing him relationships, right? And
Right.
so like my niece, sometimes I'll go to visit and she'll be on Instagram and I'll say her name and she doesn't hear me, and I'll say her name and she doesn't hear me.
Hmm.
I'll say her name and she doesn't hear me because she's so captured by what's happening. And that's always been the case. Like I remember my mom doing that when I was sitting in front of the TV, right? When I was a youngster. So I do think you can lose yourself. For some people are particularly vulnerable to it. And their sense of self is defined by who they are on the internet. And that's is that a new wave that we need to get used to? Is it a cohort thing? Or you know, is it something we should be worried about? Maybe it's a mix of both. But I do think that if the question is, can you lose yourself? I think the answer is absolutely yes, that you can lose yourself.
Yeah, and you see the importance, I think, of functional analysis again here,
Yeah.
because it depends on the person and the context, if it's functional or not.
Yeah.
And I think we shouldn't judge about a phone per se, because we know from research that Steve actually showed it to me that part of the people who are a lot on their phone is really functional. It's really they get less depressed, they get more and more sociable because they do WhatsApp a lot, because they have friends like me overseas, and you can't really meet them, so then you have to text them and send them dog videos all day, and
Mm.
so we do that and connect in a very personal way. So then it's functional. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So functional analysis, people,
Yes. That's
do
very
it.
thank
important.
you.
Yeah, really important. Barry?
Thank you for the answer. The next question, how does you, Robyn, and ACT view EMDR and IFS in treatment of trauma?
Yes. So when I look at the theory behind EMDR as written by Francine Shapiro, it feels a little muddled to me. I've tried to sort it out, but I think it's hard to understand what it is that she's actually saying and describing there. But when I look at it from just a straightforward behavioral perspective, then I can see some ways in which EMDR and ACT can line up. There's some ways in which it departs, and we've actually made some adjustments inside of EMDR to be more consistent. And I'm not basing this on any data per se, but when I think about what you're doing with bilateral stimulation is, if you think about something like, you're doing a rhythmic process, let's say, with the butterfly tap or the sound in the ear, or some other form of bilateral stimulation, there is kind of a quality to it that's like a rhythm, boom, 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 boom. And if you do enough of a rhythmic process, it can create a tiny bit of an altered state. And so I think what's happening, and this is just my opinion, I think what's happening is people are coming into a little bit of an altered state that allows them to process painful memories a little bit easier. So it's like opening up to experiencing in this kind of semi-altered state. And it's probably what's happening with the psychedelic drug movement as well.
Yeah.
And so we're just opening people up a little bit and then making room through this process. The thing about EMDR that doesn't really work well in terms of philosophically and theoretically is that when you're doing EMDR, part of the process is to look at the negative and positive cognitions, and that you have to install a positive cognition that the person has to believe at a 7, scales 1 to 7, which just doesn't fit in terms of the ACT model of diffusion and being separate from your mind. It's not that believing something is a problematic per se. Again, it's functional analysis. Like, I can believe something, like, I can say, yeah, I really believe that, and it doesn't cause any problems for me.
Yeah.
But if you want to be consistent and coherent theoretically, you do not install positive memories that you believe 100%.
Yeah, because then they can become rigid, right?
You can become rigid in that space.
Yeah.
And so we've just adapted it a tiny bit, where instead of installing a positive cognition, we're talking about ways of thinking that broaden your understandings, and instead of, do you believe it, are you willing to open up to other possibilities here, other ways of exploring and discovering and being curious about the world? So it's a broaden and build rather than a you must believe. And that feels more consistent to me. If you're going to do that work, it's like, let's see what else is possible in terms of your views. It's a perspective taking exercise in a way. It's like, what other perspectives can you take?
Because isn't this just, because that's my opinion, it's just one of those many perspective taking exercises, like doing drugs as well. Like, you get in an altered state, you see, okay, I am not my trauma, I'm a person with a trauma, because you do something else, and an active stimulus makes you aware in a different way, gives you a different perspective, and then you can look at your thoughts instead of, that's it, right?
And we're actually doing some EMDR in our clinic, and what we see there is that folks, our clinic is based on ACT, like everything is ACT oriented and conceptualized.
Yeah.
And we're doing prolonged exposure, written exposure therapy for trauma, and EMDR, and a little bit of cognitive processing, but we also have to tweak that one too. cognitive processing therapy for trauma. And it fits nicely because we have an understanding of it that's coherent and theoretically coherent. And so I think they can work nicely together. And the data says that EMDR works. We can't ignore the number of studies that have been done that show that it can be effective for people. If there are EMDR therapists here, I'm going to say something that I'll apologize in advance for. Apology. Is that I do exposure, and most, it's the way it's taught is it is not exposure, it is processing, but processing and exposure to me are equivalent.
Yeah.
And so I do think that you're again and again exposing people to an image that takes
That's an interesting, wow. Processing and exposure is the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting.
But I know that if there's some, really strong EMDR therapists here, I'd probably get my wrist slapped for saying that. And so, because they, at least in the United States, you cannot equate exposure and processing. There, it's a more of a way of like digesting the memory, so to speak. And I think that's what you're doing when you're exposing, is you're helping people.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But that's why I said apologies to anybody.
Also, from a theoretical perspective, I think eye movement is not the kind.
You don't need it. There's plenty of studies that show you don't need eye movement.
Right. So that's an important thing as well. I think not to be like small about it, but yeah, if we have good theory, the theory has to follow the practical data, I think.
There are a couple of studies that if you compare the different forms of bilateral stimulation that show that eye movement maybe has a little bit more of an impact, but generally they all work.
Yeah.
What form of bilateral stimulation you're doing. And so eye movement is not necessary, so to speak, to get the kind of recovery that you see.
Yeah, this is so cool to talk about. Okay, what's the real definition of this process? Because I think we should do that more as a field, not only within ACT, but what's really going on here, because we have so many resemblance with exposure with, I mean, so many people do kind of the same things, but in a different way, I think. So,
well, there's a real argument in the literature about whether EMDR is an exposure therapy or not. And there's people are really glued to their ideas about it. And kind of might be a little bit challenging. But I do think, you're putting an image in your head again and again, and that's exposure.
Yeah, same process. Yeah. Barry, great question, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one more question. Do you have any comment on the possible relation between ACT and positive psychology?
I think we can learn a lot from positive psychology, because one of the things that I really appreciate about their work is this sort of idea of broaden and build and grow and extend. And so when I think about how perspective taking does the same thing, like we can inform each other around those kinds of things. And one of the things that we tend to do, that I myself am trying to work on as well as I'm implementing ACT in the clinic, is that we get so focused on the pain that we forget the joy. And so, people connect to things that are joyful, or that they found joyful, or maybe they were in awe, or they were inspired, tapping into there's like 6 or 7 moral emotions, but tapping into the emotions that are around joy and awe and pride, not prideful, the feeling of pride, like when you've done something really good and you feel that kind of rise in your chest, like that sense of pride. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about boastful pride. Like connecting people to those experiences, I think, is really what is the full range of human emotion. And because we're in the field of helping human suffering, we tend to tune in a lot to the kind of painful side of it, and stretching back into a joy and awe, I think, is really important. And positive psychology, I think, does a pretty good job of that kind of stuff. So I appreciate that about the positive psychology arena. I mean, there's some things that theoretically that don't quite line up all the way, but there's a lot to appreciate about the work that they do.
Yeah, and I think that the reason why I love your style so much is that there's always a form of lightness in whatever you do. You can have a talk with a patient with the most severe trauma, and you get really deep into that. And even then, when you do that, it's never unsafe. It's never heavy. It's always light, and that's just the magical thing I think about. I don't mean it to make you blush, but that's just so unique about your style because even in the deepest things you do with the clients, the toughest things, I feel this lightness that you're connecting with. So yeah,
Holding this all, holding your insights all lightly, I think is really a healthy thing. And just when I think about a sense of humor, like it is a powerful demonstration of flexibility. If you can laugh at yourself a little bit, even when there's some pain, and you can kind of laugh at the things, the ridiculousness of the world that can be going on, like there's a flexibility inside of it. So I use it as a
you
measure.
do that. You make little jokes, even if on the very that's kind of a diffusion
Yeah,
thing almost.
yeah, it's a diffusion.
Yeah,
And if you get clients, this is harder to say, but if you get clients who can't laugh, they're harder to work with.
yeah,
They're more rigid. And so it's kind of a measure for me in a way of
yeah.
how rigid somebody is or how locked in they are.
Yeah, I always say act therapy without laughter is not act therapy. That's just doing nothing. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we have another one, Barry, right?
Happy to answer some more.
Perfect, thank you. In the Netherlands, there's much research on how EMDR might work through taxing the working memory. You can read it in the chat if it's not clear what I'm saying, Robyn.
Yeah. No, I am aware of that, the working memory hypothesis. So thank you.
It seems to me that it might block experiential avoidance. Does that make sense to you?
EMDR or
Yeah.
I think probably it probably does in some way reduce avoidance. Yeah, I think that's correct.
no?
Okay.
We can give short answers.
Yeah, is that okay? Yeah, I agree.
That's, yeah, and there's one.
We
I
can do
see
that too.
there's one more question. If you have any thoughts on compassion-focused therapy, it's a more general question. If you have some thoughts about that.
I've been through one of Paul Gilbert's, 4-day trainings on compassion focused therapy. And I think that the exercises inside of his work that you do, the experiential work, is amazing and creates a lot of openness and is act consistent. I do think that when you're looking at threat, and if you're under a lot of threat, which can be generated from internally as well, not just externally, but that you are in not a very good place to take things in. And so this is why I think safety, especially in trauma treatment, is so important.
Hmm.
Part of that safety comes from the therapeutic relationship and how you work inside of a relational process. And so I think when I think about the work that's being done in CFT, I really appreciate it. There's a few places where I get tangled up in the theoretical understanding that feels like I would like things to be kind of Occam's razor, parsimonious, like let's get down to like the most basic elements that we need to make something understandable. And sometimes I can get kind of caught up in the complexity, as with EMDR. There's a complexity in Paul Gilbert's theory and rationale and model that sometimes feels a little challenging. But The clinical work, I think, is quite good and matches very nicely with things that we're doing in acceptance and commitment therapy. I hope that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, when I read the book, for instance, like The Compassionate Mind or some of those, I'm just like, whoa, what?
Mm.
Sometimes the people who, and Steve has this problem too, like Steve, you know, Paul Gilbert, Francine Shapiro, like you read and it's so dense. It's like, how do you take that and digest it and turn it into something that works for clinicians?
Yeah.
You know, sometimes I have to kind of muscle my way through things and to try to make sense of what's happening. And I have to read things a lot.
Yeah.
So,
I read the PBT book 3 times, I think, before I kind of understood it.
yeah.
So, yeah. Okay. I think we're gonna wrap this up, right, Mary?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it for now, I think. Thank you very much, Robyn.
Thank you so much, Robyn, for doing this.
It's absolutely my pleasure. It's so nice to see folks on the camera and friendly faces and folks that I know. And it's really wonderful to, hopefully people found this somewhat interesting anyway.
I hope
Right.
so. I hope the questions were good, and yeah, just thank you so much, and we'll be seeing more of you. I hope in the coming years, also in the Netherlands.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll be in the Netherlands, I think, not too long from now.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. I will stop the recording.